Since the beginning of America, our country has been on the path to equality through people who rose into leadership and passed the limits of their generation to usher change for social injustice. Each of these leaders persevered through hardships. Their actions were a catalyst that brought change. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines equality as the quality or state of being equal. It is human nature to yearn to be equal to our peers. I propose that a new national monument called Mount Equality for All be built and include the following people: Jane Addams, Helen Keller, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Martin Luther King Jr. To honor their efforts for equality in their generation, the location for this new national monument would be Mount Elbert, located in Colorado. Colorado is a beautiful state with a high tourism rate and would serve as a great location for a new national monument. Through the history of the United States, there has been great injustice towards people who made up this nation. Each of these great leaders became forerunners for change. Jane Addams. I first recommend Jane Addams for Mount Equality for All. She was born September 6, 1860 in Cedarville, Illinois. She grew up in a prominent family. Jane lost her mother at a young age of 2 years old, her father at the age of 20, and multiple siblings. Jane graduated from Rockford Female Seminary. After graduation, she traveled through Europe and visited Toynbee Hall, which was part of the settlement movement. The visit influenced Jane to co-found Hull House in Chicago's 19th Ward with her friend Ellen Gates Starr. The Hull House functioned as a settlement house that served the needs of the large immigrant community. In the novel Spirit in Action, it is stated that Addams and Starr were among many of their generation who longed to bridge the social gap between rich and poor by strengthening ties across class lines. Jane had a vision for the Hull House and wanted to bring equality to poor and those without a voice. Jane was a social worker and activist in her time. She served on the board of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and as president of the Women's International League for Peace. Jane was the first woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. She spent her life dedicated to public service and the movement of equality. My next nomination for Mount Equality for All is Helen Keller. Helen was born June 27, 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama. At the age of 19 months, she suffered an illness that left her blind, deaf, and unable to speak. This caused frustration, and she was prone to daily physical outbursts. In the book, The Story of My Life, Helen Keller, she writes, "The deaf and blind find it very difficult to acquire the amenities of conversation. How much more this difficulty must be augmented in the case of those who are both deaf and blind." On March 3, 1887, Annie Sullivan came into Helen's life and successfully taught her to communicate through signing letters, to read, write, and speak. Helen attended Radcliffe College and graduated with honors. She became an author and donated the profits from her sales to the schools and services for the blind and deaf. In 1924, she joined the American Foundation for the Blind. With an interpreter, she traveled and shared through lectures about her disability and equality. Helen's life and story brought attention to the disabled more than ever. She was a strong advocate for the disabled and women's rights. Her work and dedication throughout her life to bring attention to disabilities and women's rights left a legacy that stands for equality. I would also include Eleanor Roosevelt, who lived a life devoted to equality and public service till her death, be a figure for Mount Equality for All. Born October 11, 1884, in New York City, her family was privileged but suffered great loss. She lost both of her parents and a brother at a young age. She had a difficult childhood. She was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. She married her distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, March 17, 1905, who went on to become the 32nd president. During her husband's presidency, she used her position to transform the role of First Lady. She was an activist for women, African Americans, and those in need. Included in the text, Transformative First Lady, The White House butler Alonzo Fields is quoted as saying, "Mrs. Roosevelt was more concerned about people being swept under the national rug to injustice than she was about someone finding dirt under the White House rug." The citizens of America were her priority in office. She devoted her time as First Lady and the rest of her life to people and the injustices they faced. Mrs. Roosevelt aligned her support for civil rights and supported the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Till her death, November 7, 1962, she stood for equality. My final nomination for Mount Equality for All is Martin Luther King Jr. King was born in Atlanta, Georgia, January 15, 1929. He rose to leadership during the Montgomery bus boycott. King was a co-founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He led people to protest peacefully without violence. His message was met with violence from those who opposed him. His house was bombed, and he was stabbed for his message and stance. He accepted the opportunity to encourage people through his speeches and writings and reached over hundreds of thousands with his words. He empowered a nonviolent movement for civil rights. On August 28, 1963, to almost 250,000 people, King gave his famous speech in Washington at the nation's capital. In the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., in his I Have a Dream speech, he spoke the words, "We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence." King used his gift with words and wisdom to lead a movement. He was and is respected for his message and life's work for civil rights. In the textbook Created Equal, the author expresses that King became the most powerful spokesperson for the civil rights movement. In 1964, at the age of 35, he was the youngest to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his leadership. King was assassinated on April 4, 1968. He was murdered and ultimately lost his life because of his role in the fight for civil rights and equality for all. Each of these leaders stood for equality. Their leadership brought change and a movement in a society that limited change. Their stand for change, for social justice and civil rights, changed our nation to what it is today. Each of these leaders, activists, and social workers exemplify a change for equality. I nominate these candidates to be honored with this monument so their efforts can be further memorialized. People who would visit Mount Equality for All would learn and could be motivated and educated by these leaders to become doers in their generation for injustice. Each of these great leaders became forerunners for change and would make a great addition to a new national monument.